Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, climate change and the coming visit of Pope Francis to the U.S. Our guest, Brandon Wu, Senior Policy Analyst of the Action Aid USA. Mr. Wu, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Pope Francis linked global warming to the main theme of his papacy. He says, fighting inequality and global poverty. He has committed his papacy to being the champion of the poor, and he says, the earth is the poorest of the poor. And the director of Greenpeace in Italy, his name is Giuseppe Onufrio, has says climate change is now an issue of social justice. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's been a long time coming for us to get to this point. Previously, we've been talking about climate change as something that affects the ice caps in the Arctic, or something that affects polar bears. And now we're talking about it as something that affects people. And I think that what Pope Francis is doing is he's talking about the moral dimension of climate change, the way that this global phenomenon is really disproportionately impacting the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. And I think that that's a really important part of this debate that's been missing until just the last couple of years.
Your words, quote, the so-called developed world in the US and other industrialized countries, which are about less than 20% of the population, those countries are responsible for over 70% of the greenhouse gases. Is climate change a man-made phenomenon?
Yes. So there is a huge scientific consensus that human activity is driving increased global temperatures. And that's human activity in the form of what you just said, greenhouse gas emissions, like carbon dioxide, for example, from fossil fuel power plants, or gas-burning cars, that sort of thing.
Please explain us for an audience who not necessarily are absolutely very much familiarized with the phenomenon of climate change. How it is manifest now is going to be manifested in the short-term future, mid-term, long-term future.
So a lot of what we're seeing are these changing weather patterns. And these are things that scientists tell us are directly linked to climate change. So we have an average global temperature rise. But what that means locally are things like more intense storms, like more intense hurricanes, more intense cyclones, more unpredictable droughts and floods, which are especially a problem for farmers, for example, in developing countries who are dependent on rainfall for their crops. These are all things that they're not necessarily linked on a one-to-one basis. Like, we can't necessarily say that this drought is directly caused by climate change. What we do know is that climate change increases the probability of things like this happening, like worse droughts, worse floods, worse storms.
And that effect, or those effects in plural, are irreversible or are reversible?
Well, they're reversible in the long term. Right. So
what is the long term for you?
So, for example, what the conversation is about in climate change policy right now is keeping the global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius on average. Where we are right now is 0.8 degrees above what we call pre-industrial levels. So before we started putting out all these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, before the Industrial Revolution. And that 0.8 degrees, we're already seeing massive impacts from. So things like Hurricane Katrina, things like typhoons that have been hitting the Philippines, a lot of these we can say are exacerbated by climate change. Now, if we immediately stop all greenhouse gas emissions now, that's not going to mean that immediately the temperature drops and these impacts go away. There's a long time delay, and scientists...
Long time is 10 years, 20 years, 50 years?
I would say more on the 50-year time scale.
Just to reverse the 0.8 Celsius degrees.
Yes, but what that tells us is that we have to take action now, because even if we take action now, we're still in for a long period of impacts that we'll need to cope with. If we don't take action now, it just gets worse.
Pope Francis has said, quote, the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. And do you think that the Pope should have got involved in this climate change issue?
Sure, yeah. I think in his encyclical, the 200-page document that he authored on climate change, he really lays out the theological case for why this is something that is relevant for the Church. It is about stewardship of the planet. These are moral issues because they are affecting people. They are affecting the poorest and most vulnerable. And so absolutely, I think these are relevant things for someone like the Pope to be talking about.
And what are your expectations regarding the Pope? Well, the papal visit here to the U.S. is coming very shortly.
Yes.
And he's going to be addressing for the first time ever the U.S. Congress. First time that a Pope is going to be addressing the Congress. What are your expectations regarding the impact of that address?
Well, I hope that it will have a great impact. You know, there are many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are Catholic. And the way that the Pope is highlighting this issue as a moral issue that Catholics and people of faith more generally need to care about, you know, I think that it will have some impact. I hope that it will have not only an impact, you know, in Congress when he speaks there, but really more broadly within the United States as well, because I think these are issues that, you know, at least here in Washington, a lot of the faith-based organizations here are starting to think about, you know, caring for the global commons and what they call creation care. And if that's a message that is spread throughout congregations in this country, in part thanks to this very high-profile visit that the Pope is making to Washington, I think that would be a very good thing.
A recent article on the Huffington Post, exactly on July the 20th, was titled, quote, "Pope Francis' U.S. visit likely to spark tensions over climate change and unfettered capitalism." From whom you anticipate that could be those criticisms coming?
Well, I think we already know, we've already seen some of that criticism from you know, some more conservative Catholics in this country who either don't believe, or in the case of some public officials, politically don't want to say that climate change is real or is man-made or is linked to issues of poverty and inequality. And I think, you know, that's a correct assessment. The Pope's visit is going to cause some tensions. It already has caused some tensions because he's written about these things very publicly. And I think honestly, I think that's a healthy tension, because I think this is an issue that needs public debate. It is an issue that we have to be honest about. And if there are folks who are not able to say that, you know, we trust that 99% of scientists are correct and that this is a real problem.
But there are Republicans in the Congress that they say that they do not believe that climate change is real. Among them, we have currently we have three presidential Republican candidates. We're talking Ted Cruz, we're talking Mark Rubio, we're talking Ron Paul. Your gut feeling tells you that they deeply believe that it's not real, or simply they have that sort of position because what they really represent is the interests of big corporations that they could see in regulations to try to stop the climate change, a way to stop or reduce their profits. What is your gut feeling?
So I don't want to speculate on any individual candidates or members of Congress, but I will say that my gut feeling is that for many Republicans who are holding office, the problem is actually not necessarily that they don't believe this is real. I think the problem is, exactly as you said, the constituents who they are most responsive to may actually believe that this is a real problem, but they're afraid of the solutions.
Afraid in which sense?
Because the solutions to this problem, which are drastically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, fundamentally that means transforming our economy.
Costing money for them.
For them, yes. Yes.
And therefore, they don't want to spend.
Yes. So I mean, what we're talking about when we talk about solving climate change is we're talking about transitioning to a new, fundamentally different, more sustainable global economy. And that means people who have a lot of money invested in the current system potentially have a lot to lose.
Lose in terms of profits.
Yes.
Precisely. We're talking, for example, a clear example that has been pointed out by organizations like Greenpeace, an organization, large corporations, one of the largest in the world. We're talking about Chevron, ex-Texaco, because they absorbed Texaco, that they know that at least 20 to 30 years ago, they knew exactly the damage that fossil fuels were creating to the planet. And they did nothing because of
worse
interest.
than nothing. In fact, there's a new study that came out from the Union of Concerned Scientists showing that a lot of these fossil fuel companies were actually creating misinformation.
So lying.
So they actually knew that these impacts were coming, and they were fostering misinformation to say that basically, oh, everything is fine, so that we can keep doing business as usual.
Doing business, making fortune, billions of dollars of profits, among them Chevron, Texaco. And in your words, because talking about basically the economic interest behind all that, you say there is, your words, there is a gap on trust. You're referring to trust what? The information of the scientists, the information of whom?
So I think what you're referring to when I was speaking was a gap of trust between countries in the global climate negotiations. But I think also it's not so much a gap of trust in what you're referring to here, not so much a gap of trust in, say, the public doesn't trust scientists, or even the corporations who are profiting off of fossil fuels don't trust scientists. It's really fundamentally that there is a conflict of interest between a fossil fuel company and solving the problem of climate change. It's not really about trust, it's really just about bottom lines.
And what do you think that is the involvement, if you could identify the involvement of the private sector in the US regarding this issue?
Well, the private sector, of course, is hugely diverse, right? So the giant fossil fuel companies like you're talking about are the private sector. So are small renewable energy firms. That's also the private sector. And they have very different roles potentially to play in reducing climate change and solving the problem.
And the US, as a society, is doing, in your assessment, enough to create campaigns of public awareness in order to, quote unquote, educate the American public about what climate change is all about and the consequences?
No, I think the U.S. could be doing a lot more. And when you say the U.S., I assume you mean the U.S. government.
Yeah, the U.S. society, because the government is part of the society, sure, but you have the rest of the society that is not the government. I mean, the private sector could organize themselves, ONGs, et cetera, et cetera.
So I mean, I think what we're seeing in the last few years is a much more vibrant effort in the U.S. to talk about climate change.
Coming from where?
Coming from, as you said, NGOs, from local activists who are fighting, for example, the Keystone XL pipeline, or who are fighting polluting power plants in their neighborhoods. And I think one of the things about the last couple of years, going back to this theme that this is an issue about people, this is a moral issue, it's not just an environmental issue, is that we're seeing people making the link between climate change as an environmental issue and much more local struggles about people of color who are struggling with zoning laws that mean that they're stuck with dirty power plants polluting the air that they breathe, or Native American communities who are fighting pipelines that are being built through their territory. We're starting to see that all these things are linked, and there's much more of a discourse now in the U.S. than there used to be about this. But again, we still have this fundamental political problem that there are very powerful interests in this country and elsewhere that are threatened by the idea of solving this problem through an economic transformation.
They are threatened themselves, and in a way they are threatening through the mass media, the corporate media if you want, There is absolutely a study that the mass media in the US is in the hands of 6 large corporations that control about 90% of the information agenda of what we're watching in news every night. Close to 300 million Americans are, if you want, in the hands of those messages. And just to put a name, in this political campaign, there is the only independent senator for the last 30 years and now is running as a Democrat, that is Bernie Sanders. He's absolutely against the Keystone Pipeline. And he said it's absolutely against the interests of the American public. Immediately, that mass media is labeled him as this is a socialist. It's almost like we're still in the Cold War. He's a communist. He's almost a terrorist. So anyone in this game of interests who wants to dare to come to bring to the attention of the public, to the American public, that is against their interests, absolutely is labeled in a negative way. It's, if you want, discredit. It's, they launch a campaign against a type of person.
Sure. And so, centralized corporate control of mass media is a fact, right? And that's a fact that we've been living with in this country for many years now. What's also a fact, though, is that, as I was saying, there are really vibrant campaigns going on from the grassroots, from the bottom up. And in this day and age of things like social media, there are other ways to kind of spread the word about things that people can do. And I think Keystone XL is actually a perfect example of this. 5 years ago, maybe even less, maybe 2-3 years ago, it would have been unthinkable that a major candidate for office, much less the president himself, would raise serious questions about this pipeline. It was seen as a sort of foregone conclusion. But there's been so much organizing at the local level that's been amplified, not necessarily by the mass media, but through other channels, that it's been able to have a real impact on their process. And that's the kind of stuff that we need to see more of and that needs to intensify, because these sorts of changes, we need to win these victories and lock them in and win them more quickly.
What are the other quote-unquote industrialized countries or developed countries doing on this subject?
So we see, we see a lot of the same problems in other countries.
Mostly in Europe.
Like European countries, but also Australia, Canada, Japan. These are historically the largest polluters in terms of greenhouse gases. And they have all, just like us, they have all benefited from that pollution. They all have companies that have benefited from that. They
meaning only the owners of the corporations that are...
No, the societies as a whole. We have high living standards in part because of industrialization, which has caused greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, the benefits are certainly concentrated in the hands of the owners of many of these big companies. And that's where a lot of the problem is, because those are the same people who have a lot of political power. So in all of these industrialized countries, there's a similar struggle, right? About you have these entrenched, wealthy, powerful interests who benefit from the status quo, and solving this problem fundamentally means moving away from the status quo to something different.
In those developed countries, this issue is public or political concern, is high in the list of priorities?
I would say it's generally higher in Europe than it is in the United States. But of course, Europe, there are many countries in Europe. Germany, for example, is a little further along the curve than, say, Poland, which is highly dependent on coal. But generally, the sort of really vehement denial that climate change is a problem, it seems to me, as someone who works for an international NGO, it seems to me that that problem is much worse here in the US than elsewhere.
Because of what? What do you think?
I think just because of the way the political discourse has evolved here, and the way that corporate power plays out in our society as compared to some others.
And going back to the papal visit, the Pope is coming here to Washington, and then he's going to New York, and he's going to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. What are your expectations in terms of the impact that address could have?
Well, so I'm actually a little bit skeptical about the impact.
I mean, he's going to be talking about climate change among other subjects in the.
On climate change, I'm a little bit skeptical of the impact that will have when he speaks to the UN. So of course there is a UN process going on right now that is supposed to culminate in a big international negotiation in Paris this December, where all countries are supposed to come up with a collective global plan, basically, to address climate change. Now, what the Pope says in New York on that, among other things, really I don't think is going to influence that very much, because the outcome of those negotiations really depends on what sorts of mandates each government has, which is really all about domestic politics. Now, the Pope can deliver, I think, a very helpful message saying that we need an urgent solution to this problem, and one that takes into account both the social and environmental dimensions of the problem. So he can deliver a sort of top-line guidance. Whether or not that actually influences what governments can do, I'm more skeptical of.
What are your expectations regarding that conference of climate change on December in Paris?
So I think what Paris will deliver will be an incremental step forward. So it will be better than nothing. It won't be anywhere near what is needed to solve the problem. So we can expect countries to make fairly low-level commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to addressing climate impacts. And those commitments will be better than not having any commitments at all. But the scale of the change that's needed is not even really on the table. What Paris can do, though, what that negotiation can do, is really catalyze, I think, people around the world to look at this problem, say, okay, this is a real problem. Our governments have acted. They've done their best. It's not nearly enough, and we need to do much more.
Next year, 2016, presidential elections in the US. Could having a president of one party or the other one has an impact in the position of the US in terms of policy regarding climate change?
Oh, absolutely. I think 2016 in many ways is more important than the late 2015 moment in Paris. 2016 we'll see, as you mentioned, elections in the US. 2016 we'll see how we as people, not just as governments, respond to the challenge. So we'll have an outcome from the UN negotiations in Paris, but how we respond to that, I think, is crucial. If we say, okay, the problem is solved, then we're in trouble. If we say, well, nothing got accomplished there, this is hopeless, there's no way that we can solve this problem, it's just too big, that's also not a good outcome. If, on the other hand, we say, okay, in 2015 our government said they would do X, Y, and Z, that's the bare minimum. We have to hold them to those commitments, and they have to do more. And we're going to work to hold them to those commitments through things like elections, like engaging in electoral politics to make sure the right people get elected. That's the outcome we need to see. Because you're right, if we get a Republican administration after 2016, the chances that the US lives up to the kinds of commitments that we're making at the UN on climate change become much lower. And that'll be a real challenge.
The developed world sees the developing world in the future as a threat in order to accomplish the reduction, if you want, of climate change or pollution. They're right or wrong?
Well, they're wrong overall. So what you'll hear is that, oh, actually China now is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And that's true, but it is completely devoid of historical and social context. So China has over four times more population than the United States. So if we're being fair about this, we should look at level of pollution on a per capita basis. And if you look at it on a per capita basis, Canada, the United States, Japan, and Europe are still by far the largest emitters.
For example, the US, in terms of the whole pollution, in which percentage the US participates about?
I don't know percentage-wise. I know that we are the second largest polluter behind China with 1/4 of the population. And if you look at, again, if you look at historical responsibility, so not just what countries are doing now, but what they've done since the beginning of the industrial era, then the US and Europe are by far still the largest polluters. And that history is relevant because greenhouse gas emissions, once they're in the atmosphere, they don't go away. They stay there and they continue to impact the climate.
Finally, what your organization does?
So my organization works primarily with poor and vulnerable communities in developing countries. And so this is extremely relevant to climate change. We work with a lot of, for example, smallholder farming communities who are dependent on rain-fed agriculture to feed themselves and to make a living. And so this is actually directly tied into your previous question about the role of developing countries. Another country that is coming under criticism now from the US and others is India, for example. India, which is increasing in its greenhouse gas pollution, and developed countries want India to reduce that pollution as part of their sort of fair share. Now, the issue there is that India has at least 300 million people that don't have access to energy, which is a huge problem in terms of poverty and human development. And if we ask India to immediately reduce their emissions, which means stopping the use of all fossil fuels and transitioning to new forms of renewable energy, and we ask them to do that without any support, without any international finance, what we're asking India to do is leave millions of people in poverty. And that's just not politically tenable for any Indian government. So the things that things that we have an obligation to do in wealthier countries in the north, they don't directly translate to countries like China and India, much less to poorer countries like, say, Bangladesh or Malawi, which have huge amounts of population that are going to be impacted or are being impacted by climate change and no resources to deal with it. So any just global solution has to involve supporting those countries in their action.
Brandon Wu, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.